Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Ins and Outs of Templates webinar. A few logistical notes before we get started this afternoon. Please mute your microphones for the duration of the webinar. Questions can be asked with the chat box, and we'll take time to address all of the questions at the end of the webinar. Additionally, a revised PowerPoint was sent out this afternoon, so please check your email if you have not done so already so that you can follow along. And I would like to introduce today's speakers, Sharon Crust and Cynthia Herbert. Sharon Crust is a certified member of the Appraisers Association and the first vice president, and Sharon also teaches appraisal writing workshop for the Appraisal Institute. Cynthia Herbert is a certified member of the association as well, and she is the board president. Cynthia is an instructor for the Appraisal Institute of America, the Appraisers Association of America, and an AQB certified USPAP instructor. And we will get started. Thank you, Sharon and Cynthia.
Okay. So you've heard a little bit about Cynthia and I and how we've been members and board members of the Appraisers Association. Just a little bit about, I'm certified in post-war contemporary and emerging art. I'm sure many of you know me from the appraisal writing class. So my background is I have a master's in art history. I did a regional gallery by me. I was a docent at the Whitney Museum of American Art, and I've been an advisor and or appraiser for over 25 years now. Happy to be here to go over these ins and outs of templates because I know so many of you have issues when trying to use the template. So hopefully we'll answer all of your questions. Cynthia?
Hi, Cynthia Herbert. I'm delighted to be here. Again, just finishing up my term as president, and I am a certified member, certified in household contents, and as Teresa noted, instructor for USPAP, as well as several classes for the Appraisal Institute and the association.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to go through all of the parts of the appraisal, what relates to USPAP compliancy, what relates to the IRS rules and regulations. But I wanted to give you a little bit of a background as to why we decided to provide these appraisal templates, which I'm sure all of you are happy to have. There was a major discussion within the Appraisers Association some number of years ago. I think we started providing the templates in 2010, and we probably worked on them for a year to two before we provided them. So the issues within the Appraisers Association was really the fact of were we spoon feeding this information to our members, and if we just gave them these templates, would they not understand the structure of an appraisal template and what needed to be included, and how to actually write a good appraisal report. Those were the issues that some people felt why we should not. The reasons why we decided to give these to our members were the fact that there are a lot of issues within USPAP and with IRS regulations that we wanted to make sure our appraisers, our members, were protected from, and that they had everything within these appraisals that they should have. Many of you have the connoisseurship, have the understanding of how to value a work, but we wanted to make sure that you also included all of the information that if your appraisals were ever reviewed, they would hold up.
Right, and also to note that USPAP does not dictate form or format, as you've all heard. So whereas you're not required to use anyone's templates or these templates in particular, it is recommended strictly because they cover all of the bases. If you want to switch around the language or switch around the order, that's your personal preference. But the information that is included in the templates should be in your report in some way or form.
Right. Yeah. So as we've talked about before, you can adapt these to, if you want to move things around, or to the look of your brand. So you can certainly change the font, change where the header and footer is, but just make sure that you have included all of the information that we currently have in the appraisal template. And we will go through this, and some of it is Appraisers Association suggests you put it in rather than it being a USPAP rule. So here on the first one, you see we sort of have listed USPAP compliancy. So the scope of work is the first one that we're going to talk about. Identify the problem to be solved. So this is really, what is the project? Why are you writing this appraisal? What has the client asked you to provide them with?
The problem to solve in USPAP is the first 6 steps. Identify the client, the intended user, the intended use, the type of value, the effective date, the approach to value, and your assignment conditions. That is your quote-unquote problem to be solved. Why does the client need an appraisal? From there, obviously, we determine the scope of work. Who do we need to talk to? What kind of research and analyses must be performed? Where must it be performed? How? And so forth. And then obviously disclosing our work, our research and analyses performed and research and analyses not performed, not only in compliance with the scope of work rule, but in compliance with Standards Rule 7, which is the development standard for personal property appraisals, and then obviously Standards Rule 8, which is the reporting standard for our appraisal reports. And when we go through one of our templates, you'll be able to note exactly how the templates tick each of the boxes required with regard to disclosure as far as USPAP is concerned. Not only the disclosure in the certification pages, but the disclosure required throughout the report in your the work to be done, the scope of work.
Right. So we don't need to state these over again. You can read all of these, but these are the issues that we are addressing within the templates. And then aside from USPAP on certain appraisals, we also have IRS regulations that we have to make sure we're complying with as well. So, the issue of qualified appraiser, which is really important to make sure that you have the connoisseurship, the history of appraising this type of work, and the experience in appraising this type of work, and the education in appraising this type of work. So what has just come into as a regulation on a qualified appraiser is a little bit more onerous on the appraiser than it used to be in terms of education. So make sure you have all of that.
Yeah, the final regs. We've been working with temporary regs since 2006. The regs were finalized, as was noted in our national conference last year. The final regs were passed last July to take effect January 2019. And the regs do outline the requirements. They're no longer temporary, they're finalized. The requirements for education, verifiable experience. So these are requirements of the IRS specifically.
Yeah, and past exposure to the item, if you've had any financial interest in the item, and this is for a donation appraisal, for an IRS donation appraisal. So if you sold this work to your client or had any financial interest in this work, then you cannot do a donation appraisal. So we've gone through a few of these. And of course, this statement, very important to include the statement that the appraiser understands the penalties of overstatement or understatement of value under Section 6701A.
Also interesting to note is that in the finalized regs, whereas the temporary regs used to reference a qualified appraiser and a qualified appraisal met the requirements or were generally accepted standards were referenced in the temporary regs. In the final regs, the IRS no longer references generally accepted standards vaguely. It actually mentions USPAP. Generally accepted standards, including uniform standards of professional appraisal practice. So right as of 2019, the regs actually do reference USPAP and a USPAP compliant report as meeting the qualified appraisal, and a USPAP compliant appraiser meeting the competency and ethics requirements also as a qualified appraiser.
So then here we just mentioned the statements and indemnifications, which has additional legal protection for the appraiser. And then all appraisals must include header, name and contact information for the appraiser, footer name of the client, type of value, purpose of the appraisal, effective date. So this is really what the Appraisers Association feels should be there. It is not a USPAP or an IRS regulation, but we believe that you should make sure that this is included on each page of the appraisal. And a part of that is also so that if you need to reference any part of the appraisal, you have all that information in each page that you can reference. Oh, sorry, I wanted to go to this first. All right, so Cynthia put this together for you so that you can actually see what we've just talked about, and where we're using the donation appraisal, the non-cash charitable contribution appraisal report for as an example of where each of the USPAP compliant or IRS regulations are.
Wow, my bad.
Sorry, just bear with us for one moment.
We can put this up. We can put this way. There. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So here again, this just briefly to go through the report, why things are included. So we just put in the reference to whether it was the scope of work, or actually in this case, I just referenced standards rule 8 primarily because this is the appraisal report, and therefore this is the reporting standard, and this is what we need compliance with in this situation. So as you can see, although it's not particularly in order of 8.1, 8.2, 8.3, everything included, required in a certification page, in disclosure is included. So if we go straight to page 3, here's your appraiser certification. Not only do we reference the USPAP, but also IRS final regs, for instance, at the very top, when I have previously appraised works by artist/similar works, that is an IRS requirement that you must, not only is it competency, but also that you are familiar with the work.
Right, yeah, the experience as well.
And this is your verifiable experience in addition to your verifiable education. So most of these references are USPAP. And again, you can always check your USPAP book if you want the actual reference. At the bottom here, I understand that this appraisal report will be used in a connection with a tax return. That is part of the commentary, again, required by IRS, not USPAP. So it gives you an idea of really there's very little in the template that should not be in there. Just to remind again, everyone, USPAP refers to minimum requirements. So you can always and probably should consider adding more to your report as far as information and so forth. But as you can see, based on the tabs here, especially in the scope of work, there is a reason for everything that is in the template.
Just go through a couple more.
Do you want to discuss the limiting conditions and extraordinary assumptions now or later?
Yeah, I guess we might as well, as long as we're going through them, let's talk about some of these issues that come up on a regular basis.
Yeah, your assignment conditions. What are assignment conditions? These are, they can be physical as well as it could be economic conditions or any kind of limitations. What are you met with at the time of the assignment? Each assignment has assignment-specific conditions. Anything limiting your ability to see the work, document the work, catalog the work, your limitations to speak to specialists, any limitations imposed at all are assignment conditions that need to be noted. Limiting conditions tend to lead to extraordinary assumptions. Each assignment will have assignment-specific extraordinary assumptions. Assumptions that may, if proven to be incorrect at a later date, could affect the appraiser's opinions and conclusions. You're just noting that. So, whereas in the template, you'll find we do note some very general extraordinary assumptions, such as the information provided by the client is assumed to be correct. Again, if it wasn't, it might affect our opinions and conclusions. The information, gathered through aggregators or information provided by experts is assumed to be correct. These are extraordinary assumptions. You're relying on them with full faith in. There's no reason to doubt them, but should it prove to be incorrect later, after the effective date, then your opinions and conclusions may be affected. Each assignment will have different assignment conditions, different extraordinary assumptions, possibly hypothetical conditions, but they really should be considered independently per assignment. These are not the only extraordinary assumptions that probably apply to your report, the ones that are in the templates. They may be fundamental, but the likelihood is there are others that you should be considering.
Yeah, so over here, I just noticed that it said, or state if there are none under extraordinary assumptions. So there are never no extraordinary assumptions. You are always relying on the fact that the information that you have, that, if you think the work is authentic, and you've been given information to lead you to that assumption, then that is an extraordinary assumption. There may later on be new research that proves that that was not authentic, okay? And then obviously it would be a different value. So it's always authenticity. It's title. You're assuming that there's clear title to this. Unless you had somebody, do a legal title search on this, then that's an assumption, right? The client tells you, yes, I own it 100%. You're assuming that's correct. The other thing that I see a lot is the note here, if the clients provided verbal information regarding the provenance of the articles listed herein, I am not responsible for the accuracy of this information. So, especially when it's one item, don't use that language. The client either did or did not give you verbal information. So adjust that accordingly. And if they did give you verbal information on the provenance, then you're assuming that they're giving you the correct information. Of course, you're doing your research. And if the research doesn't show any reason to not agree with what they've told you, then that's an assumption. And that could change if for some reason something else comes up later on that shows that the provenance was incorrect. So there are always extraordinary assumptions, and we're listing the major ones. There might be, as Cynthia said, additional ones for your specific assignment. The same thing with assumptions, and you're assuming that the database information and consulting sources are correct, that you've used, they may be incorrect. So, sometimes that does happen. And I always try to use more than one database source so that I can confirm that that number is correct. But that is also an assumption. And when we talk about the medium is assumed correct as represented, that again is the issue of if it's a print and you wrote it was a lithograph, but it was a screen print, that's not going to affect the value. You're assuming that's correct. Or if it's a contemporary artist and you wrote down that it's an oil on canvas and it's actually an acrylic on canvas, it's not going to affect the value. If you're appraising jewelry and you assumed that it was white gold and it's actually platinum, obviously that's an extraordinary assumption, not just an assumption, because that would affect the value. So those are the things for each individual appraisal report you have to consider and decide where you put that information in, but you are always going to have assumptions and extraordinary assumptions.
Right, and just remember, any limiting condition generally leads to an extraordinary assumption. So if you weren't able to take something off the wall or move it away from a wall, there should be some kind of extraordinary assumption noting items were not removed from the wall and you're expecting the condition to be as stated, even though the items were not seen in 360 degrees. So there's no downside to noting your extraordinary assumptions or any limiting conditions, because it sets the context for the reader, the intended user, to understand how you developed your opinions and how you are reporting your opinions.
May I ask a question?
Okay.
Sure.
Oh, Sharon, I just wanted to ask you, for the assumptions, the database info is assumed to be correct. Could you give some other examples for just assumptions?
Other than database?
Yeah.
And media?
Yes.
I can't think of anything offhand. More often than not, if there's something else, it falls into an extraordinary assumption than just an assumption. Because the assumption is that if that information is incorrect,
it will not
affect the value. So most of your assumptions, if they're incorrect, are going to affect your value. You want to go back to the PowerPoint?
Okay. No. Thank you so much.
And then we talked about the limiting conditions, and those are, as Cynthia said, if you couldn't take a huge piece off the wall, and therefore provenance information that may be in a label on the back, or the condition of something that's not seen on the recto but is seen on the verso, you're not recognizing. Or if it's a print that's been matted and framed and you're not removing it from the frame and you're examining it under the glazing, there might be something under the matting that you are not seeing. So those are all limiting conditions that then go into extraordinary assumptions. Anything else on here?
Well, if you should be, again, the importance of disclosing what you did and why, and what you didn't do it why is not, there's no downside to it. If, for instance, your reports should read, the appropriate scope of work per USPAP is what would your peers do? What an intended user would expect to find, and what would your peers expect to find? So for instance, if you're in a situation where there is a question possibly about authenticity, but the foremost expert with whom you would need to confer is out of the country for the next 9 months and there's just no way to have access, well, then you would want to note why you did not speak to that foremost expert. Because your peers, if they were reviewing your report, would expect to have had some kind of information from this expert, whether it was a confirmation of authenticity or not, but something. So you would want to disclose that and in your scope of work, this is not actually an extraordinary assumption, but this is a disclosure. You would disclose that the foremost expert could not be consulted with for the following reasons. So there's no question as to why wouldn't you have spoken to this person. It's disclosed. So that's actually not an extraordinary assumption, I apologize, but that's the importance of disclosure of your overall scope of work, of which assignment conditions are part. No, just again,
Okay.
why, again, your disclosures, you have your approach to value and the definition, the fact that you didn't use the other approaches to value is also discussed, the definition of value, the citation. These are all just the requirements.
Let's just go here. Yeah, so as I had mentioned, the statements and indemnifications are really, they're not used PAP or IRS rules and regulations, but rather they're in here for your own protection, right? So there are all of the things that may come up that are to protect you.
And some of it really is actually a reiteration of what you have in your certification page and actually some in your scope of work, but it reiterates it for a client and brings up other things. It also notes the work file retention and so forth.
Okay. Let's go back to PowerPoint.
So that should answer the question as to why the things in the template are in the templates.
So then the disclosure would go under scope of work?
Your disclosure goes under scope of work. Yes, when you're writing your report, your scope of work is really, you're just outlining the steps that you took. So your scope of work, you're going to disclose all the information about the client, intended users, intended use, assignment conditions, so on and so forth, and any kind of disclosures would go under there.
I have one other question. Can we
Sure.
reiterate some information on the certification page and the qualification page?
Such as, what do you mean
Well-
by reiterate?
Reiterate why I would feel that I'm qualified to proceed with an appraisal.
That should be in your qualifications, appraiser's qualifications page, and if you'd like to put it elsewhere, you certainly can.
Yeah, as we mentioned, the templates are to
Yeah.
make sure that everything is there. You can always do more. You can always
Yeah.
add more, but we feel that you should at least have all of these things in it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So here we're just going to quickly go through the elements of a correctly prepared appraisal. This is what is included in our appraisal templates, just so that you understand again how we created them, what we were looking at, what we were thinking about, what we needed to include in the appraisal. So name and address of client, the name and contact information and qualifications of the appraiser, the signed certification page. And remember, it's really important that you remember to sign that certification page. Scope of work, which we've just talked about, purpose of the appraisal, which is the appraiser's objective, the type of report, approach to value used and defined, type of valuation used and defined, the marketplace in which the valuation is applied, relevant dates, description of the appraised objects, the support for your valuation conclusions, really important, especially in a donation appraisal, right? So for anything for the IRS, you want to make sure that they understand how you got to that valuation. So state of the market discussion, the market analysis, the comparables, and that comparable analysis. If you list a comparable, you have to discuss how that comparable relates to the subject work, statements and indemnifications and disclaimers, appraisals relating to IRS, estate or donation. So that's the, oops, sorry. Okay. So here are we've just listed some of the things that we talked about before. The statement that the appraiser acknowledges that the appraisal will be used in connection with a tax return, and you understand the valuation, substantial gross or misstatement resulting from the appraisal can result in a fine. The appraiser's tax ID number needs to go in there. Statement of the appraiser's qualifications specific to the item. So remember, you need to show that you have the experience, education, understand the connoisseurship of that particular item. Statement of how the objects were acquired and prices paid, if known. So sometimes our client gives us that information and sometimes we don't have it. And the completion of the IRS Form 8283 for a donation appraisal. And then the Getty object ID. So this is how we've set out to write our description of the item. We also need to include an image of that as well as this description and the supplemental information. If you have it, provenance, literature, exhibition history, comparables, the discussion of the artist, craftsperson, and the discussion of the marketplace. Okay. So we have the Appraisers Association.
Excuse me.
Yes.
What is could you go back one, please?
So the Getty ID. So this is based on, the Getty has created this object ID listing of how you should describe an object. So that's where we got this from.
Is there any place that I could find that, do you think?
Yeah.
You can look it up by Object ID, Getty Object ID online. It'll take you right to their website.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, so the Appraisers Association has created 4 templates for our members. We will talk about other types of appraisals that fall outside of these templates and how you would adapt them, but we're going to start with these, the specific templates that we've created. So the first one is the insurance template, which is an appraisal report, and the key elements of that are, purpose, which is a replacement value, inventory, and appraisal report for insurance scheduling purposes. So that's the reason why you're creating this appraisal report. The approach is the sales comparison approach, or it could be the cost approach as well. So you need to consider both of them, and you may use both of these within that same appraisal. So the value is retail replacement, or market value, or it may be fair market value. So you need to check with your client and look at their policy and see how their policy reads, because not all policies read retail replacement value. So,
Right. Make sure you understand the policy language. If it's retail replacement new, retail replacement used, actual cash value, often it will depend on whether it's an appreciable asset or a depreciable asset. So it's very important to understand what your client needs and how their policy actually reads in order to make your report viable for them.
yeah, and sometimes that means that you may have to speak to their insurance agent to understand how the appraisal should really read, what they're actually asking for.
Right.
So the client and the owner of the property, that's usually the same person, but it could be different. It could be a huge collection, and they might have a collections manager that's the client, and the owner is obviously the owner. The effective date, which is the date of inspection for an insurance appraisal, and that is always the reason for the effective date being the date of inspection is because that's the date that you can verify exactly where the work was, that it was actually in the client's home, or whether it was in their warehouse, or where it was, and what the exact condition of the work was. You know, a day later, somebody could have knocked it down, or, there could have been a leak in the house and it could have affected the condition of the work. So the effective date is the date that you inspected that work. If it's a huge collection and you're doing multiple dates of inspection, then the effective date is the last date of the inspection. Market analysis for these are optional. You're going to include the location of the items generally for insurance appraisals, not always, but often the insurance company would like to know where it's located so that they know if there is an incident, that what work should be affected. The description of the items, including a condition statement, really important that you note the condition of the item because that affects the value. And comparables are optional. So, you know, if it's 40 objects, you're not going to do comparables for all the objects, but there may be a couple of items that are over $100,000 that you feel, you know, you should include a comparable on those. So it's up to you as to whether you do comparables in insurance appraisal, and you decide the value of the object and or whether the client really believes that the object has a very different value than one you're going to come up with. Maybe you want to include a note on comparables or comparables in there.
Sharon, I wanted to ask you a question. Would we have to prove in that insurance report, appraisal report, how it's appreciable or depreciable using, let's say, the most recent 3 years comparable analysis?
No, in an insurance appraisal, they're really
No.
just looking for the value on that effective date. So I think Cynthia was talking more about whether you're going to use the sales comparison approach or the cost approach, depending on the individual item.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, if everyone could just keep their microphones muted, please. We'll answer all questions at the end and they can be typed into the chat box. Thank you.
I think we want to do, and now we'll just quickly, we're not going to go through the insurance appraisal, but I'm just going to put it up here so that you can see what it looks like. And all of them are, you know, based on the information that we just went over. So here you're seeing it's retail replacement value appraisal for insurance inventory purposes. Again, confirm that that's what their policy actually reads, retail replacement value. It may read something else, and then you have to change that. Also, you know, the things that you should need to look at, you should always read over the appraisal, because sometimes when we have a template, we get lazy and we're not really reading every word. But we really do need to be careful and make sure you're filling in the correct information, that it is appropriate for the appraisal you're writing. So you need to make adjustments for each individual assignment. And again, look at plurals, you know, plural or singular. I see that all the time. So, and if your report is ever questioned, and if a lawyer is looking at this report, believe me, they are going through to find any minute error that you have to show that you were not careful in writing this report. So do, you know, make sure that you've reviewed it and it is exactly correct. So when it says item or items, remove the parentheses if it's only one. You know, I like to remove the parentheses and leave it as items if there are multiple items. So all of those things you should go through and change. So just so that you can see what it looks like. There's your qualifications, the scope of work.
And when you're, let's see if we have intended users. It is, you'll note here in under users or users of appraisal report. The appraisal report can be used and relied upon by the client, a designated whoever is. These are the intended users. It is worth noting that last sentence, any other user is considered an unintended user. Again, just to put anyone else on notice that this is an insurance appraisal, or it's an appraisal report for insurance purposes, and it is not intended for any other use. It just, again, puts people on notice. What the purpose is of the report, what can be used at, because as you all know, just because you note who the intended users are, anyone can get a hold of your report. You, as an appraiser, one of the first questions you ask a client is, do you have any existing documentation? That might include a previous appraisal report. Obviously, you're not an intended user, for that appraisal report for the simple reason that that report was not done for whatever purpose you may be doing. So it just puts them on notice that this was done for a particular purpose. It cannot be used for any other purpose.
The only other thing I wanted to show you here. So again, here on total retail replacement value. So here, often if it's an insurance appraisal, I like to break it down by location or category, so that if somebody is looking at the values of certain types of works, they can see how you got to that total replacement value. So if it's one or two items, then you're not going to start putting all these different categories in there. So again, modify it to what's appropriate for you. In the insurance appraisal, we have the market analysis. Again, this is optional. But if you're doing a very high valued collection, I would suggest that you include the market analysis. If it's for lots of little, prints that are $1,000 or less, you might not want to have to write up a whole market analysis. But so that is optional. And then this is just what it looks like. Again, note on how, here, I don't know why we say this, note on how it was examined behind the glass or in the frame. You could, if you want to, reiterate again that this is a print, that you didn't take it out of the glass. But more importantly here, note on comparable sales. So you don't have to include that information, but you may want to say, these two galleries represented the artist. There were 4 works that, that were for sale at this time, that had this date, or sales that happened within the last year for similar types of items, and briefly note them, as opposed to when we do an IRS, an estate, or a donation appraisal, where we are writing in the full comparables with images and comparable analysis and all of that. Okay, so that's just what it looks like. And there's
The insurance all the same,
sources. And again, it's really important to put in these sources of data and bibliography, especially if somebody is reviewing their appraisal. They want to know how you researched it, and that you really followed through on researching it properly. Okay.
Donation, estate.
There, I got it. All right. So again, the next one we're coming up on is an estate tax template, which was going to use comparables because it is for the IRS. But again, the IRS doesn't specifically state in an estate what they're looking for in terms of comparables. They only say that they want comparables. So you have to make the decision as to the value of the item and how many comparables you include and how much comparable analysis you do on that. But just going through, again, it's fair market value appraisal. IRS is always fair market value. For estate tax filing purposes, you're going to use the sales comparison approach. The value is fair market. There's a client, and the owner is always the estate of the deceased, right? So the client and the owner are always different within an estate tax appraisal. The effective date is the date of death, or the alternative date of death, which is I've never had to use, but you should be aware that a lawyer may give you an alternate date of death, which is 6 months after the date of death. You're going to include a market analysis, the location of the items, the description of the items, including condition, as we noted before. That's really important in terms of the value, comparables, and the comparable analysis. And just to so no, didn't go over. Where did the estate go to? Maybe I need to get rid of this one. There it is. No.
Donation.
No. There it is. Okay. So here we have, just to, again, I'm not going to go through all of it, but just to see the different points that we're making here. So it's fair market value appraisal for estate tax filing, prepared for the estate of. The effective date is going to be the date of death, right? And the other area that just looks different on this than the insurance appraisal, again, here you're probably going to want to include either a location or category for a breakdown of the values. Market analysis you're going to include, and this is what the description part looks like for the estate. The image is a little bit bigger than on the insurance appraisal, and then your appraised value support with your comparables, and an image for each comparable, and then the comparable analysis. Okay.
Which one do you need down?
The PowerPoint. I don't know, when I put it down, then I lose it
Oh.
all. Next one. That's where I'm going to be. All right. Okay, so the non-cash charitable contribution template. So again, this is an appraisal report. The purpose, fair market value appraisal report for non-cash charitable contribution for IRS income tax purposes. That's a mouthful, but that's what it is. Oops. Let's just go. Why can't I go back? Okay. And here the approach is sales comparison, the value is fair market value, and then you're going to list the donor and the donee. The effective date is going to be the date of donation, which is going to be stipulated by the date of the deed of gift, which is the transfer of title, not the date that the institution receives the property, but the date that the deed of gift is signed. You're going to have a market analysis. There's a summary of the donated property page, which we've included, description of the items, comparables, and comparable analysis. And we're going to get back. This is the one that I'm not going to show you the template for this now because I'm going to get back to that shortly. And then the last one that we have a template for is this gift tax appraisal report. So again, it's fair market value appraisal report for IRS gift tax purposes, sales comparison approach, the fair market value, it's gifter and giftee. The effective date is the date of gift. You're going to include, as in the donation appraisal and market analysis, the summary of the gifted property, description, comparables, and comparable analysis. Okay, so I'm going to pull up the donation appraisal, and these are the issues that we're going to actually go into the template and there it is, okay, and work on. So,
Technical assistance.
donation appraisal. There it is. That's what I want to get to. Okay. Okay. So the first thing that we wanted, can I move this out of the way
Here,
too?
move this over here, right?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, so we want to change the header and the footer. So the appraiser's name, address, telephone number. So we're going to go into insert. No, sorry, wrong insert. Insert. Header. Edit header. Now we're in here. Okay, and we're going to get rid of this information to us, right, on that these are only for members, and then we're going to close the header and the footer. So now you can see it's now says Sharon Crust. If we want to get rid of the highlighting, we're going to highlight this text. Then we're going to go into here, no color. Okay, and that's gone, right? So those are just ways so that you see how we do that. The next thing we're going to do is, and this is a difficult part for us, if you want to add another section to your table of contents, right? And so I often, in a description of donated property, especially on an insurance or an estate appraisal, I'll break it down. I might break it down by category or by location. So let's say I want to include a grouping for paintings and a grouping for prints. So now I'm going to go to where I want to include that. So let's go to the description of the property. Okay. So here, I want to put in a heading called paintings. I'm going to now click on heading 1, right? And there you see paintings. And then on the next one, I'm going to put in a heading called, oops. Prints, heading 1, okay? Now I go back to the table of contents. Okay, here we are on the table of contents. I'm going to go to references, and I'm going to go to update table, and then I'm going to do update entire table. Click OK. And now you can see under description of donated property, I have paintings and prints included, and it has adjusted the pagination. Okay. Let's go to inserting a photograph. Let's go into, we'll insert a photograph in the market analysis. Okay. Let's say I'm talking about the artist and I want to show maybe the most famous painting by this artist or a record price. So I would go here. I'm going to go to insert. I'm going to go to pictures from my files. Click on it, the image I want, insert. And there you have the picture. In here, to change the picture, you're talking about an item. You click on the box and you see all this information about picture, so you can adjust the size of the picture. You're going to go to change picture. Again, we're going to click on the image that I want, insert, and there we have it. Okay. And then again, we talked about just reviewing the other 2 items here, which we were going to discuss, are reviewing the document for grammar and the assumptions and extraordinary assumptions, which we already spoke about. So I think those are the main issues that people have with using these templates. Okay. So I think we're doing okay.
Should we see if we have any questions?
Yeah, I'm okay. Okay. Okay, so now we went through all of the different types of appraisals that we have templates for. And now let's just talk a little bit about other types of appraisals that we don't have specific templates for, but which you may have and you may have to adapt. So the first one is a damage and loss appraisal, which is for an insurance claim. The approach is going to be the sales comparison or the cost approach. It's going to be a number of different types of values. You have to see what the insurance company is asking you for, whether they're asking you for retail replacement, market value, or fair market value. So check with that because they read differently. The client and the owner is generally the same, but the client may be an adjuster or for the insurance company. The effective date is going to be the date of incident. Of course, this may not be known, so if it is not known, then it's going to be one that they have given you, the insurance company has given you, or the date of the inspection. And you are definitely going to use comparables and include a comparable analysis, because on this one specifically, the insurance company is going to want to really understand how you got to that value, because they're going to be paying out to the client. And I would include a market analysis as well. And we're going to go over a little bit more of a damage and loss onto how you would adapt it in a minute. But then the other type of appraisals that you might be doing that you're going to have to adapt for is equitable distribution appraisal or an inventory appraisal. So equitable distribution is obviously for distribution. You're going to use a sales comparison approach. And again, the value might be marketable cash value, which is the value less expenses. So what is the price that the work would sell for, less expenses, or any fees, which is shipping, reframing, marketing, commissions, sales commissions. Any of those are included in the marketable cash value. However, you might also be asked for a market value. So sometimes when lawyers are involved, they like to use market value. So you have to check on what the value is that you're using for the equitable distribution appraisal. The client, find out who the client and the owner is. So the client may be an equitable distribution. It may be a lawyer. And then the effective date for equitable distribution, if it is either going to be a date of separation given by the lawyer or a date of inspection. Okay, so for the damage loss, how I adapt for this, you're going to start off with the item before it was damaged, the value of the item before it was damaged. Of course, sometimes an insurance company comes to you and there's an agreed upon value and they don't really care for you to give you what you think the value is. That's what's the agreed upon value. That's what's stated in the rider on the policy, and the client has agreed to that. But generally, you're starting off with the original value of the item before it was damaged. So you're doing using the insurance appraisal template for that, for the description of the item, but you are definitely including a market analysis as well, and you're going to use comparables and comparable analysis there. The next section of a damage loss appraisal is going to be, well, a damage, not a loss, is the cost of restoration. So you need to have a discussion with conservators and get proposals from them as to what it's going to cost to conserve the work. Then you're going to give a value post-treatment. So in the value post-treatment, you're going to use, again, that insurance appraisal template. You're going to show, an image of the work, the description of the work, and the value post-treatment. And then you're going to also discuss the diminution in value of the work. So sometimes the insurance company will not ask you for an absolute figure of the loss in value or diminution in value, but rather a percentage. So you have to find out, again, what the insurance company is looking for. In this, you were also talking about how the work was damaged. You have to have a discussion of what happened to the work actually, which you would put in either usually before the restoration cost. Cynthia, do you want to add anything there?
Well, you'd also have to take into account if you are doing a damage appraisal and you are looking at the work currently in damaged condition, your report is going to need to include the original condition of the work. So that will be a huge extraordinary assumption that you need to note. because you are relying on information provided to you either by the client or a previous photograph or condition report that noted the work was in good condition prior to this event. So that's an extraordinary assumption that you are now going to be relying on. If you're also doing this appraisal while the work is still damaged, then you have to use your hypothetical conditions. A hypothetical condition is as of the effective date, the work is still damaged, and you are hypothetically going to apply a value if it was conserved. So use your hypothetical conditions to describe the actual work in its current condition and then in its future post-conservation condition. So that's not only extraordinary assumption based on the condition prior to the event, but you're also applying a hypothetical condition given the fact that currently the item is still damaged. You are appraising it as if it were conserved.
Okay, so the other appraisals that we mentioned were the equitable distribution, which you have to decide on whether you're going to use an insurance appraisal template or the estate appraisal template, depending on what the client is looking for, the purpose of the appraisal or the type of value that they're looking for. So that is you're gonna decide which one is more appropriate. Of course, you're going to have to most probably make sure you change out the definitions, the source of the definitions. Those things have to be changed for it. And depending on what the client is looking for, if a lawyer is involved and you think that this appraisal report might go to court, decide whether you want to include comparables or not. They're optional, but you have to decide for yourself whether you think that you should include them or not. And again, the market analysis, the same thing. It's optional, but if you really think that the two parties are not getting along and this is going to go to court, you might want to protect yourself and include this information as well. An inventory appraisal. Did you want to include
No.
an inventory appraisal? So that often, for me, that means that it's somebody who would like an insurance, wants to know the values of the works that they have, but don't want to pay for a full-blown insurance appraisal. So I often will make these appraisals a restricted appraisal report. So I'm not going to fill it out as completely as I would fill out an insurance appraisal, and therefore it is restricted. It is for that client's eyes only. It is not to be given to the insurance company. It's not to be given to anyone else. It is just for them, and you have to decide what this inventory is for. Is it for them to decide whether they want to go forward with a full insurance appraisal, or maybe whether they are deciding that they want to cull their collection and they might want to sell some of the works. So deciding on that, you're going to decide on what type of value you're going to use for that inventory appraisal. Are you going to use retail replacement, or are you going to use marketable cash or fair market value? So you have to think of those things and decide which one is the most appropriate. And then that was the last one. So the last one that Cynthia and I talked about was also collateral loan appraisal reports. So this might be another type of appraisal report that you are being asked for by a bank that is going to be lending money to somebody for the item, and therefore you have to check with them as to what type of value they would like. Generally, it's marketable cash value, because they're going to want to know if they do have to, if the client defaults on the loan and they have to sell the piece, what they're going to get after all fees are paid. So it's most probably marketable cash value, but it may be fair market value. They may already have in place ways to sell the work. They know what their costs are, and they say, okay, just give me fair market value. And you, depending on how much they want, you can either use an insurance appraisal template or an estate appraisal template, depending on what you feel is the correct amount of information to be given to this client.
And also very important to keep in mind is, as Sharon noted when she does a restricted appraisal report, any of these templates can be, well, you wouldn't do a restricted appraisal report for IRS purposes. So, but the reports can be modified for restricted appraisal report or appraisal report. The difference in your report will be that the restricted appraisal report has the client as the only intended user. It's for their eyes only. And requirement-wise, less information needs to go into your report. Actually, all of the same information that is in the templates in order to make them compliant, the information compliant with USPAP, you need all that same information for a restricted appraisal report. The essential difference will be the amount of information you include in your disclosure and the fact that you only have the client as the intended user. That is your restricted appraisal report. The moment you have more than one intended user, like a bank or an insurance company, a broker, an attorney, an accountant, and so forth, we need to write an appraisal report, which has a client and other intended users.
I think we can open it to questions now.
Yes.
I don't know if.
Let's see if anybody in the chat here. Okay.
Where they start.
Let's start at the top here. We're going to read your questions and then respond. Should we just start at the beginning?
I think let's start here.
Okay. If a client shares a prior appraisal report that they have for your review, should this be mentioned in your appraisal statement? You mean if you're using their information, just informationally you're referring to their report? Is that the question? All right, someone asked the question, if a client shares a prior appraisal. No, again, you would want to note that information provided by the client is assumed to be correct as an extraordinary assumption, because if you are relying on any information in that appraisal, then again, you would want to note the extraordinary assumption that you are assuming the information that you're using is correct. Because if it is not correct as of the effective date, then it may change your opinions and conclusions. So you don't need to cite it specifically.
I would say that whenever I've been given a prior appraisal report, I myself always confirm that all of that information is correct. I never assume that it is. So it's sort of helpful because there might be a lot of information that you don't have to take the time to research. You can now know that it's in this book and confirm that it's in this book, or that it was in this exhibition and confirm that it was in that exhibition. So it saves you time. But I would never assume that information is correct. I would always make sure that I check that.
Yeah, but you don't need to disclose the use of that, like in your sources and bibliography, you would not need to cite that as a reference. You can if you want, but you don't need to. All right, Jin asks, if the purpose of the appraisal is sale advisory for fundraising auction, what kind of template should I use? Well, again, here you'd probably use a restricted appraisal report because the client wants to know what they might expect to get at auction. That's a for your eyes only kind of report. It's a what might they receive. It cannot be if it's yeah, I would adapt something like that. But
if that, I'm not sure if that's, is that what you're asking? If the client wants to know what it might sell for at auction, or is the client, are you asking if the client donates it and wants an appraisal report for an auction, which is not.
Yeah, I'm confused about the question. So Jen, if you can speak up, that would be
you know, that
helpful.
would be not related use. So that's the question.
So the artwork is belong to a non-profit organization, and then they might have this fundraising auction very soon, and then they want to get some kind of estimate for that
Idea
auction.
of what they should put the estimate on it for?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Then yes, then if that's for their eyes only, you could adapt the estate tax template for restricted appraisal report. You change intended users to client only, and then obviously you would have to modify adapt the type of value. If you're using marketable cash value, for instance, then you would want to cite the reference for that definition or whatever type of value you're using, but modify the appraisal to become a restricted appraisal since it's for your eyes only. All right, Barbara. Oops. I thought we have to be careful when we use the term fair market value when the report is not going to IRS. I thought that the more likely we would use the term market value appraisal instead. No, what you have to note is even for fair market value just means willing buyer, willing seller, no duress, an open market, reasonable amount of exposure time. So fair market value for IRS purposes does not just mean auction. It means the most appropriate market where things are traded. So when you are, where to be careful with regard, fair market value for IRS purposes is a hypothetical value in the first place. If let's say artwork left in an estate, the IRS wants the appraiser to value that artwork as if the estate were going to buy that artwork on the effective date, not sell it, but if they were going to buy it on that effective date, what would they be expected to pay? Which is why buyer's premium is included in the fair market value for IRS purposes.
Excuse me, this is Barbara Wallace.
Yes.
You guys sent out a nice long, a lot of information about fair market value, which I just got not so long ago. I am referring to things that would not be going to the IRS.
Yes.
I noticed that when you were talking about loss and damage, you mentioned fair market value. You kept using the term fair market value as what you sent us, you told us to be careful of using that term when it's not going to IRS.
No, you may be asked by an attorney, for instance, for a divorce situation to use fair market value. Where you have to be careful is just using the proper citation. So you may not want to use the IRS definition of fair market value in that case. You may not want to apply buyer's premium in that case. So you would find, working with the attorney, what definition of fair market value would they want you to use, because you have to cite the reference, the source of that definition. So you can use the IRS definition of fair market value. Again, you would want to cite it appropriately, but you may not want to include the requirement for buyer's premium, which the IRS does require, but is not included in the general definition of fair market value as used by others.
Right. And there is an accounting
Yes.
definition for fair market
Yes.
value also. So that's why the definition and the source of the definition is
So
always
important.
important.
Yeah.
But for the IRS, it's always specifically the IRS definition.
The definition, yes. And you can use that definition for other purposes as long as you note that it is appropriate. If it is appropriate. And the buyer's premium issue is probably not appropriate for certain assignments.
Okay.
Hello. Can you hear
Yes.
me? Hi, this is Michelle Thurs. I have a question not related to the template, but associated to the fair market value. If I'm doing a charitable donation appraisal for a contemporary art installation and the artist has a very high market value, in the primary market, whatever, and they have no auction presence.
Mhm.
But so could I use for my comps? Could I use previous sales of the artist's work from a gallery and/or trade from dealer to dealer, and then give maybe in my narrative the trajectory of the
Yes, because
Right.
what the IRS requires is most appropriate market. So if the most appropriate market for this work is only retail,
okay.
then you would need to go to the retail market as the most appropriate market and then make the proper deductions for commissions and whatever else would not be included to the artist as part of their fair market value. But yes, you create the argument. And
Thank
even for IRS makes it very clear in their definition that fair market value does not preclude the retail market. If that is the most appropriate market where the work is traded to the public, then retail it is. So you always have to consider the most appropriate market, even when looking for fair market value. Let's see, where would you disclose the buyer's premium? If you're using comparables, you would always do it in the price realized, or however you list it, price realized, including buyer's premium. So it should be, the buyer's premium should be included in whatever comparable price you are quoting.
Yeah, so if you have only the listing of the hammer price, then
Yeah.
you have to go back to that auction house to
Yeah.
find out what their buyer's premium is and include that when you're coming to your valuation.
Right. So oftentimes the auction houses now, the aggregators will list including buyer's premium, but sometimes they will just state hammer price. So yes, you are responsible for making sure that you add that additional 10%, 15%, 25%, whatever it is. Let's see, Colleen, is there a rule of thumb that can help me understand which effective date to use? Okay, there's no question whatsoever with regard to effective dates for any IRS purpose. There's just absolutely none. Effective date for a state tax appraisal is the date of death. An attorney for the estate may choose an alternate filing date, but that's for the entire estate. That's not just for the artwork or personal property. That is determined by the attorney, so it is not determined by the appraiser. So generally speaking, date of death. The gift tax is the date of the gift. Estate donation, the date of the transfer of title, not transfer of the object per se, but the transfer of title. That is the effective date. There's no rule of thumb, that's just it. The IRS requires that. Now, with regard to an insurance appraisal for scheduling, you can work that out with the client. As Sharon said, most generally, it would be when you documented that work, the date of inspection. With regard to a damage, it's the date of the damage, or as close to the damage, as close to that damage was discovered. Same thing with a loss. And then with regard to equitable distribution for a divorce case, that again needs to be determined with the attorney ideally. Is it the date of filing of separation, the date of divorce, the date of the court date? Work that out with the attorney. So in some case, and collateral loan, the likelihood is probably the date of inspection again. Whether it was physical inspection or photographs. But as far as IRS, there's no rule of thumb. There are specific dates. Everything else, you can generally get the idea from the client. But with damage, it's as close to the date of the damage, the same thing with loss. Zachary, you want to ask a question about damage or loss?
Diane, they put Zachary by accident. I just wanted to ask you if a client purchased, let's say, a painting for $10,000 20 years ago and it became damaged, and you did a comparable analysis 10 years later, and that artist's works has gone down in value, what would you use? Because the client might get upset, say if you told them the artwork was worth 2,000 today.
It is always the value as of the effective date, unless, like I said, sometimes there's a policy with a rider, and sometimes the insurance company says it is the value that is listed on the rider. You know, like Chubb gives you 150% of what's ever listed on your rider if it has gone up from there. Generally, they don't. If it's gone down, they usually don't do less than what it is in the rider. So it really is the effective date or the agreed upon valuation with the insurance company if it is listed in a rider.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Anna asks, in donation appraisals, when there is difficulty with finding the 3 comps, what do you do? And how timely do they need to be? Sometimes the sales are very old to me. Okay, well, there's no rule as far as how many comparables you should include. Sometimes you may need 8, sometimes you might need 3 to make your point. And the likelihood is you have another 50 in your work file. Again, what do you do when they are, how timely should they be? They should be per USPAP and the IRS in a reasonable a time as possible. And that will depend on the discipline. Some disciplines may have comparables that are 5 to 20 years old, and others might have comparables that are work sells all the time. So it really depends on the discipline. But if you have a hard time finding comparables, that is where you have to create an argument. You have to create a justification for your rationale. So even if you are taking comparables from 8 years ago or 10 years ago, then you need to use them to establish what your argument is going to be. No one is guaranteed comparables for their assignments. It can be very, very difficult.
Yeah, so that's when you have to start talking about the market analysis, you know, what's happened to this market, so that if you do have to pull an old comp, you're going to reference that market analysis and how the adjustment has been made for what's happened to the market for that artist.
Okay, so here's another question. If you have many items in an appraisal and one item has a limiting condition, is this mentioned at the front of the appraisal or in the entry for the individual item? You can disclose that in your scope of work. Again, if you want to highlight that specifically, or is a blanket statement, work was not removed from the walls, not removed from their frames, furniture was not removed from the wall. But then oftentimes with specific items, I will make a note within the description of that specific item if I need to highlight something specific to that item. So you could do it either place or both places or just one or the other. But definitely disclose that you did not take it out of the frame or remove it from the wall or whatever it may be. That's part of your disclosure. Okay.
We did that one already.
Okay. Condition, we did that.
We did that one.
Done. For,
okay, you have some that we haven't seen yet.
I'll read
Okay,
out.
we'll let Teresa give us a few more.
Okay, so another question, many estate items are modestly valued. What value level do you begin to provide comparables?
I, as a generalist, it depends on the value. So I will generally start, and the rarity of the object, but generally I start at about $10,000.
What's the $3,000?
$3,000 just means the IRS states that an estate with personal property valued at an aggregate of $3,000 requires an appraisal.
Okay.
Next, if a client shares a prior appraisal report that they have for your review, should this be mentioned in your appraisal statement?
We did that one and no, it's not required.
How do you phrase and list the location of the items in the home, warehouse, etc.?
So I put it under where we have that heading before it. I generally break it up by room. So I have living room, dining room, master bedroom, hallway. I list it by that. And if it's a very, very large appraisal and I'm working with another appraiser and we're doing fine art and we're doing decorative arts, then within living room, I will have living room, fine art, living room, decorative arts. So that's how I divide it up.
Okay, for estate appraisals, if the appraiser was involved with the sale or purchase of the item, are they able to do the estate appraisal for the IRS? Yes, you absolutely are. The only time you cannot do an IRS appraisal is for donation purposes if you were party to the sale or worked for that gallery or were any kind of employee and so forth. That's all in the 8283 form. But yes, you can absolutely do any other kind of appraisal.
Yeah, and if you just curated something and used that work that you had no financial interest in it, you could definitely do the appraisal on that.
Right, and you disclose that in your certification page, that you do or do not have any kind of financial interest. Should we use the I'm not sure what that one is.
Okay, yeah,
In
that we're
order.
asking if your listing works, it is you want to list the actual sale price, what the work sold for. You cannot always get that. So sometimes a gallery will tell you this work was sold and I had it listed at this amount.
Right.
And so then you use that information and you may be, depending on the artist, and if there's a waiting list for his work, maybe there is no, compensation for the work and it always sells at full price. Or if it's an artist that doesn't sell so that often, maybe you'll always get a discount, maybe you get a 10% discount regularly. So you have to decide on which one to include in that when you're giving the list value. But you can use it, but obviously the best is if you actually know the price that it's sold for.
There's a few questions here just about the table of contents and different changes. So on your member homepage where the templates are, there's also a guide to using the templates. And so that has a lot about the table of contents in there, the shading that Sharon had mentioned. And of course, you're always welcome to call. This is Teresa here at the Appraisers Association, and Patrick as well. And we're happy to walk you through things like that if they're, if they're giving you any trouble. But I always recommend looking at that document on your member homepage.
Okay, Jen, you asked, can I appraise an item that I included in an exhibition that I curated previously? Yes. If you are appraising the item, part of your certification page reads, I have or have not had previous association in the last 3 years with this item. So you would, if that exhibition was in the last 3 years, you could note that you curated this, you curated an exhibition that this object was included in, but beyond that, it's not necessary. Okay, I think, let's see, when do we engage? When do we engage with the client's insurance company and how do we get that discussion started? What I would suggest is, again, ask the client if they can either show you a copy of the policy, or if you could just ask them, you'd like to get clarification on the language, can you have access to their insurance broker? And that is information you would get directly from your client. It shouldn't be difficult at all.
Right. So when I'm talking to them about the appraisal and what they are looking for in the appraisal, what the purpose of the appraisal is, I always ask if it's an insurance appraisal. I always say to them, do you know how your policy reads? If they don't, then you would start to talk about those issues.
There's a template adding a fourth comparable.
Do you know how to insert a fourth comparable into a template? So this should be on the document. If not, please reach out to Patrick or myself.
Yeah, I can
Yeah.
quickly
Sharon
show
can
you
show
this
you,
very
yeah.
quickly. So what I do, and I don't know if this is the way to do it or not, but if I'm going to add a fourth comparable, let's get to the comparables. Here they are. So what I generally do is I just do this. I just copy this whole thing.
I don't think it's sharing that screen.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
How do I share the screen? You want to get me to it?
Yeah. We'll go here, share screen.
sharing.
Yeah.
Just click the little arrow on the side there.
and then click show.
Oh, go to here.
Word.
Is that it?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
this.
Okay, so then I highlight that, then I go to edit, copy, and then I put my cursor where I need it. Oops, cursor over here. And then go paste. And then you
Yeah.
just have to change the number to number 4. Okay? Easy.
Another question about the templates. In the header, is just the email and the phone okay, or is the address recommended as well?
I think the more information you have, the better. I don't think it, I think it helps to have more information.
Your contact
So,
information.
yeah.
This, again, USPAP does not dictate form or format. The Appraisers Association isn't dictating form or format either. This is information suggested, such as the headers. The document should be able to, if, for instance, it falls apart or out of the binder, it should be able to be fairly easily referenced. The fact that there are missing pages and so forth. So that's why you want to include this information. Do you have to put your address in there? No, it is not required by the IRS. It's not required by anyone in particular. This is just almost like letterhead, essentially. So you could choose to just have your phone number, email if you prefer. It's not a regulation or a requirement.
And to answer yes, everyone will get a copy of the recording of this webinar. You did receive the PowerPoint this afternoon, but I will send it again with the recording so that you have the up-to-date version of that. I don't know if this was answered.
Do we have a standard for encryption when electronically transmitting an appraisal? Do we have a standard for an electronic signature? Not that I know of as far as the Appraisers Association. I know that I use my own electronic signature and I just, no, that we don't provide anything like that as far as the Appraisers Association. Just make sure you do not send Word documents. Put them in a PDF so they can't be changed.
Yeah.
Don't send
I
Word.
mean, they can be, but it's
They
more
can, but it's more
difficult.
difficult. But don't send a Word document. And if you're going to be sending your report to be reviewed first, for instance, if a client asks you, or if an attorney asks you to see the report, I would suggest also watermarking the PDF that you send with some kind of a draft, or just watermarking it somehow so that it can't, it's obvious that it's not the final report and can't be used as such.
Okay, and another question, templates are artwork oriented. Do you have templates for items such as furniture or silver?
Again, the templates really are, 90% of the templates are about the information that you need in there. The actual description of the items is not that dissimilar using the Getty ID. So these can be adjusted for furniture if you need using the actual Getty ID. I personally, since I'm a generalist and I do a lot of estate work, I don't use this part of the template. I use my own body. I use the language for these certification pages and the indemnifications, title, and so forth. But the actual inventory part I do with a different format because I don't use photographs this large and I don't always use photographs.
Right, and you could, you could just write a description. You don't have to organize it this way.
Right.
I will say that when you are submitting, if you are not a member yet and you haven't submitted your appraisals for your application for membership, you must use it exactly as it is. Afterwards, and once you're a member, you can use any, change it in any way you want.
Yeah. So I use an Excel format for the body of the inventory portion. I don't use this particular format. So one more question, templates.
No,
Oh no, the one about, changing the title page. How do
you want me to just go back to here for a minute?
It's just a question about.
So here, what did they want to do on the title page? What was the question for the title page?
I don't know that question. Okay.
So
I'll
if
try
you
to find
just
it
want to, if you just want to update the pagination, again, you go into
Oh,
references.
how about if delete? The question was, what if you delete something from the title page?
That one is a harder one to do. I'm going to let you do it. Do you know how to do it?
I don't know if I know off the top of my head, but
Yeah.
please call me and I'll walk you through it.
Yeah, deleting is more difficult.
Yeah,
I
it
have
changes
done it,
something.
but it does change it. And
Well, the
you
way
have
I
to be
did is I
careful.
deleted the page. If you go to the actual page you're trying to delete, like for instance, I don't do glossary in
Right.
9/10 of my appraisals.
Right.
So if you go to the
Right.
glossary page and delete the glossary page,
Right.
it will not show up in the table of
Right.
contents.
So here, let's do that. Let's
Right.
delete that. Okay.
So
And
now there's no
let's
glossary.
Go back up to the, now you're going to have to go to update table,
And see, it removes it.
update entire table. Okay.
And
Yeah.
there you go.
And there it's
See?
gone.
Yeah, so you're better off not touching the table of contents, but working with the document and working backwards. It will
Right.
remove it from there.
Right. And the same way as if you need to add. First, you have to go to add the header.
Mhm.
And then update the table of contents as opposed to trying to add it to the table of contents itself.
Right. One more quick question. In Getty ID, can you explain what should be included in item description? Item description essentially is, as in anybody, ever cataloged, ideally starting from the top down, describing every aspect from head to toe of that object or item or the artwork, so that if a person was not standing in front of it or did not have a photograph of it, they could picture it or imagine it. So again, depending on the object that you are describing, the level of detail will change. But if you look up Getty ID, it gives you the entire breakdown. I know it's in our information. I know it's in the Appraisers Association member webpage. We have a list of the sheet of the Getty ID. So it's all available there. The premise being that you are literally describing an object so that it can be imagined. And then last question here, what education and experience level is required by the IRS? The current regs, the finalized regs read that it must be verifiable educational experience and a verifiable education and verifiable experience within that particular discipline. So you should have not only appraised that kind of artwork before, but if it's a particular artist, work by that artist or within that period, it should be your specialty.
And verifiable education, we've just had a whole discussion on this. The IRS wants you to have been graded,
Yes.
have taken a class that you were graded on. So we have discussed with them, if you are a member and have applied for membership in a certain area, your reports are graded by the admissions committee, and that is a verifiable education. So that
Within
you're
that
covered
discipline.
within
Yes.
that discipline.
So within your accreditation, that is verifiable education, and this applies specifically to donation appraisals. Specifically, not all, but donation appraisals for the IRS. They want verifiable education and verifiable experience. So yeah, are there any other questions before we break out? Okay.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Cynthia, for joining us today. That was really helpful. And just to remind everyone, you will get the recording. You can reference it afterwards as well. And thank you for spending time with us this afternoon.
Thank you so much.